Residual warmth. I came into the woods later than I should have. The road up into Marrow County is 2 lanes that forget to be shoulders, and trucks coming down from the quarry eat the edge until the white paint hangs over the ditch, like a thought someone didn't finish. I parked at the pullout below the Larkshead trailhead and cut the engine and listened to the truck east brake hiss roll past and away down into Greybrook. The refrigerator in my apartment at home would be humming then, and I had left the towel on the oven handle folded too tight, because in the morning I had been in a hurry, and a towel knows when it has been treated like a thing to take blame. The clock on the dash said 3:07. It felt later. I'd been telling people I'd take a longer path this week when I got a day off, and the day off had presented itself in the form of a text from the schedule board. Shift consolidation at the warehouse, see updated roster. The message used words like optimization and thank you and peak demand, bland phrases under a little logo that had nothing to do with our building or the sound the compressors made when they turned over and the belts picked up. It meant I hadn't been needed until the weekend. ID stopped at the corner store for a bottle of water and a packet of salted peanuts, and the barcode scanner beeped for me with its neutral chirp, and the receipt came out in a long streamer warm from the machine curling at the end, and I folded it once and put it in my pocket because some small part of me collects tiny evidences that I existed in a place where people do ordinary things. I thought I would keep to the main switchback up through Alder and Pine and get to the old fire road before 5. The county had added new posts at the head of the trail, clean wood with the burned-in emblem, a laughing jay with a pine cone, and a laminated notice screwed to the board with instructions about burn restrictions, and a smaller notice beneath about cougar sightings and do not approach. The paper had warped a little under the wash of a week's rain, and the ink had bled just enough to make a blur around the bullet points. You learn not to read those when you live here. If you take every posted warning into your stomach, you end up staying inside and listening to your refrigerator make your decisions. The first hour went the way these walks go, when you have lived them long enough to believe the woods are cutting you a deal. Every pine needle was in its place, every stilt of alder wrapped in that green veil of lichen that looks like human hair after a swim. Rosewater taste rose from the bottle when I took a careful swallow, and the smell of it made me think of how many times I had run my sink at home for a minute and pretended I could rinse the municipal out. The ground had that dry give at the top and damp insistence below, and the trail's low places held prints with a good border to them. My legs remembered the motion and did it for me, while my mind went to nothing at all, which is the trick these places give us in exchange for what the county does not have the money to maintain. After 4, I reached where the fire road cuts off, a hard turn under a sign that used to say something and now says nothing and remains important. The light was thinned by the long, pulled threads of cloud, and my mind turned down to very small things. The crack in the lid of my water bottle, the way my left bootlace was newer than my right, and showed it the ghost itch under a bandage on my finger. The compressor click in the warehouse yesterday that seemed to have slowed down by a half-second, like a song played on a radio across a street. I'd been steady in my breath since the first turn, but on the fire road I felt the air chill, and I took in a little more out of habit, and the breath appeared in front of me a while, not white yet, but visible enough to make my mouth feel named. When the light is like that, and your legs are like mine, you believe you are moving faster than you are. The road flattened and then didn't. The signage, there is not much of it up there, vanished for a time that should have been measured. I took a path that looked right because it had been taken. The ground had a bladed look where tires had gone, and rain afterwards had made a mild ribbing, the texture of an old receipt after a wash. It led me into a part of the woods that eats sound. I did not notice it until I missed the buzz of a hidden line I usually leave in the back of my hearing for comfort. In town, a fluorescent in my stairwell provides that. In the forest, it should be the insects. I heard none. When it began to be obvious to my blood that I had been stepping down when I meant to be stepping up, the road was gone. Runnels like the bones of a hand. My breath too loud, my water low enough to measure. The trees here are not unfriendly, but they have bills to pay. The light, by this time, was a color that says, "This is as good as you will get." I cut to my right because the ground told me that up in that direction was the ridge, if I had decided correctly, and not wrong. I walked on roots like a person in a house that discourages risks. I looked at the sky and saw parts of it I do not think belong to this town. A small orange shape appeared between two pines, as if someone had printed it after, a correction that had to be made before the day closed. I have been a man alone long enough to know that there are very few kinds of relief that make you hate the person you were a minute before. When I saw the tent that happened, a faded orange dome, the sort you buy online when your budget is what it is, too new for that color, not to have bled a little, not bleached to pale by the wind, because the canopy of the pines made a kindness. It sat tucked back behind a cluster of trunks where a person who knows this place would put it out of the open, near where the earth swells into a low ridge that will take the wind, S-first sentences, and keep them. A single trekking pole lay discarded in the moss beside it, silver with the lower section scraped down. No tarp, no visible pack. The guy lines were tied cleanly, and the stakes went in at the modest angle people do when they have read the sentence once. A small pile of rocks had been set to one side in the way someone does when they want to feel like their hand has cut a line between what is to be trusted and what isn't tea. A ranger might have asked questions about permit tags or fire policies, but that ranger was not present, and my body moved forward like a contour being followed. I touched the tent where the side panels meet, and it gave a little and then held, like a person's arm as they sleep. The zipper made that clean, tearing sound these coils make when the teeth are new enough to believe in themselves. Inside, a sleeping bag unrolled on a ground sheet, a half-empty water bottle with a generic label, a little mesh bag with a toothbrush and a headlamp, a pair of socks folded neatly on the pillow, as if that were a custom I had missed a paperback whose spine had not been cracked. The sleeping bag shone that cheap nylon blue that always carries a small static charge into your hand. I put a palm there because the body thinks warmth is something we are entitled to when the day goes to this color. I expected the cold of things that had been waiting. Instead, a heat rose up into my palm, deep and wet, the sort of heat a body leaves behind in a place only for a few minutes after. Everything then, all at once. The moss smell and the lemon of the cleaner someone had used weeks ago, and the metallic tang that comes when blood is described without making a mess. I withdrew my hand because even an old person uses the same bones you use to leave someone alone. I turned my head as if someone had entered the door, and the tent had no door except the one I had unzipped. There was a faint, dark stain on the bag, near where the ribs would be. Not a spill, not an old camp mud shape. The human mind, left to itself in a white room, will draw the outline of a person. In a forest on a sleeping bag, it will do the same. I stopped my breath as if I were underwater, and waited for air to become something I could use. The woods beyond the tent had gone empty. No birds, the sound my ears bring me when the highway exerts its iron desire on the world, was missing. The city had sent an alert that morning, I remembered, about substation maintenance and possible rolling outages in the late afternoon. The kind of message that uses the word window. I had shrugged when I read it at my kitchen table. I had wiped the ring my mug left and folded the towel on the oven handle into its plain self and driven up here as if the world had not been on that small track for weeks. In the tent, everything else was a far room. I crawled inside because a person will put themselves into the place that seems like a solution if the other choices are not satisfied. The sleeping bag was too warm to be reasoned with. You can warm a bag with stones, I thought, but stones smell like stones and oil and what you are not here for. I backed out, careful not to drag the bag with my knee, and the zipper made its noise again, and I half expected that to be a signal for something else to begin. The forest watched from just beyond the pines. I felt it in the way we feel a man in a stairwell turn his head when you pass, even when he is thinking about what he has to tell his wife. I did not look directly into the high 12-foot spaces between trunks because that is a posture for another person. A person on a porch with a gun and the right shoes. I looked at the ground and then at the place where my car ought to be in a vector I would be ashamed later to admit had been wrong. The orange tent felt, this is the word that is given to us, and also the wrong one, grateful behind me for having been opened. I did not stay to see who owned it. The smell inside it and the warmth on my hand arranged me for the kind of leaving that is a body's first language. I took the discarded trekking pole because a hand needs an excuse. I moved in a straight line until the notion of straight was performed into the trees, and then I moved down because down is a hope when the ridge is used up. In the blue of early evening, I misjudged a bend and came out at the lip of a dry stream bed that would be running by next week if the rain the radio had promised would make the turn. I got to the bottom by sliding, silently asking the trees to be patient with my knees. I found the fire road again in the way a person finds a lost word, by taking apart the sentence around it and then letting the sentence forget that it is performing. I saw the pullout and then my car, that faithful arrangement of metal, and hurried to it and then walked the last 10 steps because the heart is a class act. When the engine turned over, the dashboard came alive like a store waking up at opening. Lights, beep, a little provision of a map with a friendliness borrowed from the barcodes at the grocery. Driving down, the forest turned to those washes of grey that move behind one another and make a film. Headlights from a truck came up and threw the branches at me, and for a second the cabin of my car was a hallway. In a building with a stairwell and elbows brushing, and I had to counter-steer because there is no part of me that has learned the instinct to let go of the wheel for truth's sake. On the straight part of Marrow Road, the cell service came back and my phone chirped 2 alerts. One, a boil water notice for blocks south of Greybrook due to a line break and do not use hose taps, avoid irrigation. And one, a message from the warehouse reminding everyone to check the shift schedule on account of rerouted freight. The first made my tongue taste the sink at home. The second made my hand half pull to the right by the lot out of habit before I remembered where I was going. My building sits at the edge of downtown in Greybrook, a narrow rectangle of brick with a coat of paint, the color of a faded bandage. The stairwell light buzzed with the pitch it has held since I moved in. An insect saw through a thin board. The neighbor's bicycle leaned against the rail in a way that would cause regret at 2 in the morning when he came home, and I thought again of lesson plans and objects that refused to accept them. I opened my door to the old smell of my own house, the lemon cleaner I used because my mother used it, the trapped air warmth that comes from the window that never properly shuts the refrigerator's low arithmetic humming to itself. I opened the freezer and stood there a half minute and let the cold grab my forehead. I turned the faucet and ran it until the water stopped tasting like the hose bib in back of the building, and then I boiled a pot out of obedience to a town that spent its main energy teaching us how to take it in turns. In the bathroom mirror, I saw a man younger than the day and older than the night. I put my fingers to my throat and felt that pulse you go to when you have not learned a better answer for your own questions. I pulled my shirt off and saw a smear of pitch on my arm I hadn't noticed, and a scratch from a bramble, and the little white line near my wrist from a summer when my sister and I thought we could open a can on a back stoop without a tool. I showered with the curtain partly tugged back because of a habit I have never excused, and when the water went hot, then lukewarm, and then held somewhere a patient centimeter below what most people would like, I remembered the valve notice for the building in the fall that had said something about updated pressure and efficiency, and a cheerful rectangle of clip art at the bottom, a faucet with hands. I made toast and ate it at the counter, standing, because the discipline of a chair at 9 o'clock can be an absurdity. The mug I left on the counter made its ring, and I wiped it, and then without thinking I wiped the place I intended to set it again, because wiping one thing sometimes makes you want to wipe ahead a little into the future. I folded the towel on the oven handle with care, and then made it looser because I'd folded it too tight in the morning, and I am not the person I would like to be to my own towels. The tent rose into my thoughts, then the way a banner rises when you are not planning a parade. I dried my hands and went to the couch and sat the way a man sits when he thinks he may have questions and may not be permitted. And I let my eyes draw the line of the living room, to the window, to the cat asleep on the cushion curved into the parentheses of herself, to the cabinet where I keep a box of photographs that would embarrass me if I brought them out in front of anyone. The refrigerator clicked and the compressor picked up, and I thanked something for it. I realized I had brought the trekking pole in and leaned it inside the door without noticing. Its presence there made my apartment into a place that was not completely mine. I got up and put it in the hall closet to teach my apartment a lesson I could endure. Sleep was a series of instructions I gave my body, and my body agreed to only a few at a time. When I did drop off, I woke at 1:12 to the sound of a siren taking itself down Pike Street and then turning somewhere too far. At 2:40, the stairwell light buzz came and went as a neighbor tried the chain and then let it go. At 3:03, the building's heater ticked, making the sound you get on thin railings outdoors in winter, the dull coin knock that you cannot know until you live around it. The fever that comes from the day's cold tapped at my shoulders, and I pulled the blanket over my head and told myself to stop. The cat came and stood on my chest for a minute, and then resigned me to her preferred sleeping geography. At light I woke, and the first thing in my thoughts was the tent. Not a story, not a scream, not a plan. The color, the warmth from the sleeping bag on the palm of my right hand, the small oval dark near where a person would settle into their own heat. So new the warmth had not had time to remove itself, a thing you should call about to some office left over from a time when offices had perfection. I boiled water. I made coffee the way I do when I need to be a person in an advertisement telling you everything is fine. I drank it at the counter and let the ring on the countertop dry itself into a brown dot, and then I wiped it off with a paper towel as if a camera might be taking notes. I looked up the number for the ranger station on Wren Road and pressed call and listened to the rings, and then to the recorded woman who spoke like a teacher on the last day of the term. "If this is an emergency, hang up and dial the emergency number," she said. And then, "Reduced staffing today due to ongoing operations. For closures, visit our website." I left a message in the general mailbox that could not have sounded less like a person you should send a helicopter for. A tent near mile 4 off the Larkshead Fire Road, behind some young pines. Orange, looked new. Nobody there. It felt... And then I stopped before I confessed to an adjective. I finished with, "In case you're looking for anyone." I went to work because I'm the sort of person who thinks turning up is absolution. The warehouse smelled like cardboard water, and the hand soap the manager buys in bulk, and the second-hand ozone of the forklifts. The compressors clicked in that rhythm I think of as a friend who is too proud to ask for a ride. The scanner on my palm beeped itself through the morning, and the sound of it lined the day up for me. Each beep, a small, clear dot. The belts went chuff-chuff, and the men at the far bay laughed in that way men do when they want to be forgiven for the afternoon already. Over the break room sink, someone had put up a paper from the county with water advisory lifted in bold, and below it, caution still recommended for South Bank. A woman had drawn a smiley face in the corner with a black pen, an act of optimism I had to forgive and could not bear to look at. I pulled my mug from my locker, and the coffee machine in the corner burped out a sound like a person apologizing. And the coffee was the same coffee that had lived our days for a year. After lunch, I drove to the ranger station because I wanted to hear the fluorescent buzzing above a desk to prove to myself a function existed for the story I had told the machine. The lobby was a square room with chairs bolted to rails and a display of pamphlets about invasive species and ticks and how to recognize the difference between a black bear and a man wearing a sweatshirt. The fluorescent above me had a ballast that had decided to work in spasms, so the buzz came in bursts, and my jaw answered each one with a mild ache back near the hinge in a way that felt like being caught out in a lie. A ranger behind the desk, with a face that looked like it was used to being hit by weather, emerged from a door and looked at me, and the polite list behind my eyes collapsed. "You do closure notices?" I asked. My voice in that room had a tin edge to it, as if the air had been used already today for other stories with better endings. He handed me a sheet with black bars where the trail names ought to be. Larkshead was highlighted in a pink pen. "Temporary closure for ongoing incident," the sheet said. "Someone missing?" I asked. "We had a report yesterday." He did not add, "From you or not from you." He put a note on top of the sheet with a pen that had been used to write Counter 12 in thick strokes. The note read, "Please avoid the fire road. Do not move objects. Any unusual signs, call." There was a phone number at the bottom written in a hand that spends time on twos. "We get people all the time," he said, as if to put a cushion under the floor. "I saw a tent," I said, and then stopped because I couldn't figure out how to say the part about the heat. "Other reports mention a tent," he said. He did not ask me to describe color or brand. "We've got units up there and some volunteers. Wind's going to make it a little weird." "Anything specific?" I wanted a sentence with ropes and knots in it. "Hiker, mid-30s, late 30s, he said after a small pause that made the fluorescent flicker feel like a cough. "Left his car at the pullout. Doesn't seem like he went alone, except he did." Then he looked like he wished he hadn't said that, and his mouth arranged itself into ranger half apology. "I can show you," I said, hearing the brashness I despise in men who want to earn a civil role. "We've got eyes," he said. "Better if people stay out. We're asking for 72 hours, then we'll figure what the weather wants. If you saw it, it's logged." The fluorescent buzz rose into a paradoxical whistle for a second, the sort that makes your vision sharpen and darken at the same time. "Some of these things," the ranger said, and then did not gift me a cliché about time and strangers. On the way home, I stopped at Barcode Market to buy bread and detergent because symbols help. The line at the counter moved in that shuffle way, the sigh way. The barcode scanner's beeps were a rhythm I wanted to be identified by. The woman ahead of me bought bottled water and a roast chicken, and the scanner AS light had to try twice on the chicken, and the beeps came in a stutter that made the clerk frown in a theatrical way toward the manager, as if to say we need a new one. My receipt spun out long and curled, and I folded it and put it in my wallet instead of my pocket so that it would be somewhere official and have fewer rights to become a story. The hallways in my building smell like detergent, and the cigarettes the man in 3B pretends he does not smoke. The stairwell light hummed because the bulb was new. I shut my door, and the refrigerator hummed back to me like an old promise. I laid the bread on the counter and took up the mug that had been drying and poured water into it. And the water tasted like what the county believes water should taste like this week, and I thought they must be right, and I drank, and it was fine. The towel on the oven handle was askew, and I adjusted it, then adjusted it again, because the first adjustment had been too eager. The tent had become a corner in my apartment. When I turned a certain way, from sink to closeted bin, the presence of it stood just behind me, as if I had invited a stranger in to ask what time it was. I shook my head once to dislodge it like a person swatting a harmless fly and went back to my loaf of bread. When I turned again, the feeling remained. I didn't check the mirror on the bathroom door. A mirror that shows you something you are busy denying has a way of becoming prosecutor. I watched the cat, who stared at a part of the room that contained nothing and had contained nothing all day. She flicked her ear as if she knew I was counting her movements and would prefer I not. Sleep was something like the county's notices, printed on good paper, well-meaning, not entering my house. I slept in installments and woke at a digit that meant nothing and then looked again and moved to one that did, the alarm off, because I wanted to be surprised somewhere in this day. At 3 in the morning, I woke to a smell like metal and sap and old cotton, and knew in a way that I will never be allowed to describe that in my hallway, the air had been displaced in 2 small places, the size and shape of feet, and that the displacement had now ceased. I went into the hall and stood there, hands at my sides. The apartment holds nothing at night unless you give it permission. I waited for the refrigerator to click and then I could breathe. The place where I stood felt a little warmer, the way a bench keeps your shape if a bus comes right after you stand. I told myself anything rather than the thing, then slept from 4 to 6 on that lie like a person with the luck to have one of their own. In the morning, on the runner by the door, the pile was depressed in 2 shallow ovals, near where a person would be if they stopped to wipe their feet, and then somehow didn't eat. It could be the cat. It could be where. It could be everything else. I put my fingertips into those ovals, and the fibers read them and lifted back slowly. And I told myself about the mill at the edge of town that used to make paper, and had made the paper. I wrote this all on when I was 20, and the boys with their sawdust hair, and the girls who poured binder with their gloves, and the smell that went into our skin and stayed until a winter, and a change in the market turned the building into stories. The ranger station did not call me back. There were new notices with the same words on the county's site. I learned from an alert the ferry had shifted to an intermittent schedule, and the bus would run on an odd hour for 2 days, and the town asked us to reconsider discretionary travel. The radio mentioned that a number of hikers were reported missing across 3 counties this month, which is the kind of sentence that glances off you if you do not have one to lay next to it. And a man from another town said his piece about rescue budgets and allocation, and a woman said hers about volunteer fatigue and compassion bandwidth. And the radio went to a song that I forgot as soon as the last chord pointed to the ad for tires. By Thursday, I had convinced myself there were 2 things I might do that could be called trying. One was to return to Larkshead and find the tent, and stand there in daylight and persuade whatever part of me had learned the shape of its doorway to be done with the lesson. The other was to hold off and see whether the witness that had moved in behind the pad of my shoulders would take its own leave if I refused it the courtesy of a direct look. I selected the first because I had taken Friday off, and the idea of sitting in my apartment tasting hose water while my refrigerator negotiated with my conscience made me feel stupid. I left at 9 with a weather that had decided to behave, the kind that tells you quietly, you are not Victor, not a child, not even a lucky man, but you may walk. At the trailhead, the new posts had old notices on them now. Someone had tacked a photocopy of a flyer with a face and a name and the words "Last Seen" in a font that will never be bold enough. I tried not to see whether the eye line matched mine. I took the fire road up and stayed on it with a discipline my body had learned from conveyor belts. When I reached the place I believed the orange had been, there was the empty. The dirt had been rehearsed into order, boot prints overlapping without time, a track where a heavy boot had pivoted and then an older one lost under it, a dragged mark that could have been a tent laid down by hands that did not want to lay it down. A plastic water bottle cap ground into the gravel near a peeled stick, a piece of red tape with E2 written on it in marker, tied to a twig hung at knee height, and a similar E3 further on. I stepped around and then realized stepping around was a flamboyance and stood still. I heard voices, some distance up the road, colorless the way men go when they put themselves to tasks that require them. I tried to stand the way a person standing on their own ground stands, and failed. A ranger in a hat appeared from the thin trees with a volunteer in a neon vest who looked like he belonged to a different family, and they walked toward me, and the ranger lifted a palm, and I lifted mine and then held mine down because I had no license. "You're quicker than the sign," the ranger said. It was the same man from the station, or a face that knows that face and carries its instruction. "I came to look," I said. "We all do," he said. He stood the way a person stands who has spent long days helping strangers and has learned to make his stance say, "I cannot carry you unless you let me, and I cannot let you either." "We got reports," he said in his service voice. "We're building out a pattern. Hear something from town?" "No," I said. "I saw the tent." He nodded as if he had been given a sentence he could put on a form. The volunteer with the vest wrote my name on a clipboard in letters big enough to read at a lower light. The ranger gestured toward the road. "Best to go down for now," he said. "We don't need fresh prints." I went down in the steady way I had come. When I reached the car, the tin of peanuts on the passenger seat had heated enough in the sun to change the smell of its own interior. I put the trekking pole in the footwell and then felt ashamed for putting it there, as if again I wanted to write an explanation in an official handwriting for the interior of my car. At the pullout on the way down, the phone grabbed a bar of service. A new text from the warehouse said several trucks would be delayed, and there was a call out for a Sunday shift. Reply Y to accept. I did, because the other option was to write nothing and let a man I do not dislike look at a list and put his finger down beside my name and feel relief that he can move it to a different column. That evening, the cat stared at the wall again, and I decided I would borrow a tent. The idea felt sensible for 1/4 of a second and thin for the rest, like a line of work I want but cannot perform. I texted Laura from the warehouse because she is the kind of person who owns 2 of everything needful, and 1 more for the person who will ask at the worst time. She texted back, "Front closet, take it." No other sentence. I went down to her place on the 2nd floor and knocked, and no one answered because she was on shift in receiving, but she had left the door unlocked, and the closeted dark smelled like a cedar that had been stored in a worse place for years. I found the orange dome wrapped in a stuff sack. I put it under my arm and walked upstairs past the art on the wall we share that a previous tenant had left an old photograph of Greybrook from the bridge, when the mill still carried hay in the town's mind, and men walked that bridge with intentions that would embarrass them now. It is stupid to set up a tent in a living room and feel like you are telling your furniture about something you did that you can't own in a better way. I cleared a space between the couch and the window and shook out the tent and unrolled the poles and slotted them together until they made that long, taut curve that turns rooms into places, and I threaded the pole through the sleeves and set the 4 corners. The cat hid under the chair with the deliberate expression of a retiree, embarrassed for a relative. I zipped the door open, and the zipper made the sound at a different pitch from the tent in the woods, and that difference helped. I put my hand on the sleeping bag Laura had left inside the sack, as if she had known I would be too polite to ask. It was cool. I was ashamed to be grateful for that. I sat down on the couch and watched the tent's sides breathe up and down with the minute changes in the air from the heater. The refrigerator clicked and hummed. The stairwell light buzzed the way it would later that night when my neighbor came home and coughed, and the chain pulled once, and the glass clicked in its cap. I left the tent up. I told myself the living room didn't mind. When I brushed my teeth, the bathroom mirror accepted the body in front of it, which was not nothing. I put a towel on the rack and then took it back and folded it differently and put it back, and felt cheaper than I wanted to admit. The bed was cold in a loyal way, I slept and dreamed of road signs without letters. I woke twice to the sound of the traffic light at Wren and Pike doing its steady duty, and then once to the sound it makes when it falters, the long red flash that confuses men in pickups at 3 and makes them decide themselves instead of letting the town decide for them. In the second part of the night, I heard a sound in my living room like a person brushing fabric against knee. I went and stood in the doorway and let my eyes do that thing that changes their mind about being night eyes. And in the tent, something cooled the air near the floor, the way a neighbor shuts a drawer, careful not to wake someone you are fond of. In the morning, I put my hand into the tent and on the sleeping bag and felt it warm and pulled it back. The warmth had the old temperature of waking. I put my hand in again and kept it there until the warmth felt like a measurement I could assign a number to, and then removed it, ashamed at what number I would invent. I zipped the tent and left it to its own diligence. The circle on the counter from my mug the night before was dry, and I wiped it and told myself I would find better things to do with my hands. The ranger station did call then, a woman this time. Her voice did that spring thing, where you put a smile in because you have learned a smile in the voice makes the content survive. "We're aware of the tent," she said. "If you're worried about a person, we have a line you can give a name to." I told her no names but my own, and she read mine back and said, "Appreciate the report." Behind her voice, there were the noises I love in offices. The small radio catching at a word when a man passes with one on his belt, the fidget of a pen, the fluorescence ballast at the edge of defeat, the sound of a refrigerator in a back room that makes sure no one has to think about what is inside in a minute. The following days made a pattern of their own. I worked the Sunday shift and the doors on the dock opened onto a cold that scrolled through the bay and made the plastic wrap on the unit snap. The scanner gun beeped, and the dot on the screen next to each number made a row of small, perfect ovals until one didn't see, and the list of back orders did what it had been doing since winter. I came home and opened the tent and put a hand on the bag, and it was not warm. And then at night I heard the fabric sound, and in the morning I started to leave small things in the tent. A book, the pen I use at the kitchen table when I'm pretending to be the sort of person who keeps accounts, a towel folded in half. In the morning when I put my hand on the bag, the towel had moved a fraction to the side, and the pen was at the bottom of the tent by the door, as if someone had decided to leave, and then not yet. The cat would not go in. I told myself everything. That heat rises and a tent collects it. That a bag, once warmed by my hand, gives it back all night the way bread you took from the oven leaves the kitchen able to pretend to be a bakery until morning. That my body, having experienced one sort of heat, had made it a plan to find it again everywhere. That grief finds its object regardless of what the object does, that love does, that fear does. I told myself the ranger had a kindness he could not offer, and I would have to invent it myself. I told myself the warehouse needed me to complete a line, so that another line could be completed after. I told myself a tent is a tent. On a Wednesday, the town issued a notice about a boil order again, and then withdrew it, and then issued a map with one part green and another a yellow that looked like a bruise. I filled my jar and boiled the water because it gave me a chore, and because the sound of water boiling is one of the few songs the kitchen knows that makes me want to cry. The landlord taped a note to the building S door that said, "Please conserve, boiler service Friday, apologies." And under his note someone wrote, "No problem," with 3 exclamation marks. The traffic light at Wren this week stalled twice on yellow, and I saw 4 cars creep through the intersection like children playing a game the teacher had not noticed. The day I decided not to decide, it rained. A clean rain, the one that comes from the ocean without the smell of land in it. The cat went to the window and patted at the glass with a joke in her paw. The refrigerator hummed, and I put my ear to the thin side of it and listened until I could hear the compressor S click that starts the hum and the change in pitch as the day takes heat out and the small silence that follows. On the counter, the lighthouse magnet held 4 notices: water, power, trail, ferry. Under the magnet, a line of receipts, folded in half, then half again, like the bones in a fish. I went into the living room and stood next to the tent like a man at a bus stop, wanting to say something to the person beside him who looks like him standing. I put my hand on the sleeping bag and felt the cold, because for the first time in a week I had not slept in the apartment and instead had fallen asleep in the old desk chair for a few hours and woke with my arms going to ground. I reached out and pressed my hand down anyway and held it there until the cold was not cold, and then until it returned to cold, and then removed it. In the mirror of the window, I saw a shape behind me lean and then hold. I began to dream of tents set up in other rooms. In the break room at work, between the vending machines, the fluorescent turning the fly of the tent, a color that belongs to factories. In the aisle at Bark's Market, where the barcodes get scanned. A small dome, a child's playhouse sneaking into the stores of adults. In the room at the ranger station behind the counter, the woman with the careful voice putting her paperwork on a camp table and deciding this is what needs to be done now. I woke from these to discover the dream had not had the decency to paint in the voices at the edges. It had left the world silent except for the things that know how to perform their function with or without audiences. On a Friday, I took the borrowed tent down. I folded it the way films teach you, shaking the poles down to the short segments with the little rope running through, making a long rectangle out of the fly and rolling it toward the bag until the air went out with that lung sound new canvas gives in store displays. I put it in the closet of the spare room and shut the door and felt noble and foolish in the same motion. The closet's door sighed when shut. I put my ear against it like a child, because if you're going to become again the person you were when you had a tent in your living room, you may as well commit. From inside came a faint sound, not heat, not fabric, not a person, a tiny static, as if a radio in another apartment turned on to relieve its person from listening to their own sleeping. I returned it to Laura on Saturday. She shrugged when I thanked her, and she said, "Any time," and it had the force of truth. She did not invite an explanation the way some kind people do who want to know who need to know who can, to let you keep the thing for yourself without making it better by saying it out loud. I went home by way of the big grocery because the building asked for coffee and I had gone through the jar and kept fastening my mouth to nothing in the morning. The barcode scanner faltered again and I stood in line and the beep came late on every third item and the woman ahead of me adjusted her hair in the mirror above the register, the convex glass doing its job of making the store look like a joke. I stepped aside when the mirror showed my face as if it were a first thing and then returned, and the mirror made me a person again. And I found that my body was now trained to try to convince glass. On the walk back, the town smelled like hot tar and salt, and the small left-behind breaths of the river, Essian. The traffic light at Wren was proper for a little while. The siren on Pike waited until the song on a radio had ended before doing its own song, which was nice but unnecessary. The stairwell in my building held the smell of someone's hose water use. The landlord had left a bucket by the first landing with the lid off, and the water in it had the film that comes when a building decides to keep a story to itself. My apartment was the one it had been before the tent. The refrigerator had taken itself upon itself to be an example. I wiped the counter until I had worn off the day. The towel on the oven handle fell off when I turned to reach for a glass, and I put it back with a salute to its job. When night came, I stood in the hall and did not encounter anything I could put in a paragraph. I stood there until the calves ached and then stopped. When I went to bed, I forgot to care which side to put my face on, which has been a problem since I was 20 and learned that face lines are a thing, and I have never forgiven myself for knowing that. In the morning, I woke to a small ring burned into the oak of my bedside table, where I had set down a glass without a coaster. It looked like a sign, the kind of sign people put in books with a chisel. I wiped it, and it stayed. I went back up that afternoon. Larkshead, Fire Road, the small turn, the Rangers E2 and E3 tapes crisp in the rain. A volunteer looked at me like a person and then like a sign, and I turned my hands out to show I held nothing. I looked for orange and found every shade but. In the flat, there was a small square a person had cut into ground cover, large enough to lay a map down and make a choice. The rectangle had captured warmth. It gave it back to my hand when I hovered it there like a man trying to tell if a stove knows it is off. Farther in, past where I had been, the trees thinned and the ground went to that completely wrong grey that forestry departments lay down when they need to drive a machine across a soft thing. My boots made that small crunch sound of rock, finding new ways to be rock under you. A truck had made wide arcs in it, and a pair of smaller prints went to the left and down, and then didn't return. I followed them without letting my heart be smart, and found the stream bed, damp now, a thin run of water making the right sound if you were not disappointed in it. On a little rise beyond it, I found a piece of orange fabric snagged on a branch, the corner of a fly. I let it be. I looked up the hill like a person summoned to a battle by someone who cannot be found. And then I walked back to the road, and then to the pullout, and then to my car, and then to my stairwell, and then to my door, and then into my kitchen, and then stood and waited for my refrigerator to tell me what to do next. I set a kettle. I took a mug down, a different one, the one that has a chip at the base where it meets the counter when I'm careless. I looked at the lighthouse magnet and the stack of receipts, and the 4 notices like a clipboard for a man who has done better than I have and always will. I opened the closet where I had put the tent and sat on the floor and waited for a sound I could put a name to. The static in there had grown. I heard something that was not a radio and not a person. A low electrical breath, the kind of sound a compressor makes when it is worried but cannot articulate it. I closed the door and the sound went down a fraction and came up again slowly like a tide. That night in dreams, I was in an orange place, and the world outside it was the world, and I felt heat under my shoulder and then under my ribs and then on my palm. And I woke with my hand on my chest, as if the part of me that would run my life without me had decided to be careful. The day went on like a warehouse shift, with 5 extra pallets at the end. The town made small choices on my behalf. The stairwell light, the siren, the scanner, S-beep from someone, S-apartment down the hall, as they ran groceries over it to make sense of what the week owed them. Sunday after work, I did, finally, the thing the story had arranged me for. I packed a day bag without telling myself it was a day bag. Water, bread, the peanuts I should have eaten earlier in the golden season. A towel, a roll of thin cord, a tarp, the borrowed tent. I put the trekking pole beside the bag and watched myself with an honesty I rarely have. The cat looked at me and then did not, which was a favor. I wrote a note and put it on the counter under the lighthouse magnet that said, "Back later." I wrote nothing else because nothing else is true. The forest that day was honest about its temperature and its laws. I passed no one. The laminated notices at the trailhead had taken on water again, and the ink in the word "closure" had begun to fuzz. The sky on the ridge told me I could have 3 hours without embarrassment. I went not to the Fire Road and the Rangers tapes, but south of it, where I've gone when I need a smell I know enough to leave sad. I moved through the alder, the low ferns, the places where the soil is carved by animals I would not be able to identify, in lines that go nowhere. I carried the tent, and I did not. The body, when asked to carry the last thing you asked of it, will ask you very little in return. I found a flat, not unlike the one where I had seen the tent before. It was not hidden from the road, but it was not visible either. I did not think about whatever it is a person thinks about when they do harm. I thought about my refrigerator waiting for me to return, and the small compressor click and the mug ring's dry outline on the counter, and whether the towel had been hung right, and whether my sister would laugh at me for worrying about that if I told her this story sometime before I lost the ability to tell stories like this. I shook out the tent and clicked the poles together and threaded them through the sleeves and set the pegs and pulled the fly straight and set the towel inside willfully like a person making a divot for a child's head. I put my hand on the sleeping bag and felt the cold that had lived there since it was a bag, all the plastics arranged and waiting for an order. The forest listened. The rain had stopped, and the cones made that small, soft thing they make when they are convinced they have already been claimed. The light went to that level where it is kinder to stay where you are. I unzipped the tent and crawled inside and zipped it again and lay down on the sleeping bag as if it were what a person would call a bed if they had not known a better word. And I folded the towel on the pillow under my head and rested my palm near my ribs, because my palm now has a mind of its own whenever it is away from me, and I closed my eyes. Heat gathered. It takes a while when it is earned. The breath we have becomes service. The first minutes were cold, and then the next were tolerable, and then the next was something I could forgive. Outside, a small branch somewhere upset itself into two smaller. Inside, the air went quiet, the way a house goes quiet when a child falls asleep at the wrong time. I did not think about who the other person was. I did not think about things that have names. I breathed, and the bag learned the shape of that new knowledge. When the draft came, it did not come as a hand. The zipper's metal teeth changed their temperature. The fabric near my knees gave. A small sound like a person shifting quietly to make no sound of their own. If I had turned and looked, I would have learned a fact that would have cancelled others. I did not turn. I kept my body the shape you keep it when your sister sits on the edge of the bed to tell you she is leaving town for very good reasons. I kept my breath, the kind you do when a person next to you starts to dream and you want to let them have it. I slept, without naming it sleep, as long as that had a right to be, and then woke to a cold I could take into me and stand. I unzipped the door, and the woods were a color I have seen in a few paintings in the hall of the courthouse, the ones no one stops at because they are between the portraits of men and the portrait of the lake. I stood, and the bag under me gave me the warmth it had taken, and I stepped out and put my feet on the ground, and the ground accepted them. It did not solve anything. I still had to drive home and listen to the refrigerator and hang the towel, and the scanner would beep on Wednesday, and the ferry would go when it went, and the stairwell light would work until it didn't, and the county would tell us to boil or not to boil, and a woman with the right voice would have to call me one day and tell me there was nothing anyone could do. I leave this to say that standing in a room or in a tent or in a forest is sometimes the only power we have against the way the world insists on defining our outlines. A tent is a place that remembers heat and gives it back to a stranger, which is more than most of us can do consistently. The man whose tent I found, the woman whose name I fold into a receipt in my wallet and never read, the face on the Ranger S copy that does nothing and less than nothing to arrest the rotation of a day. They all stood here, and then they did not. The bag holds a warm place for a little while. The town holds whatever songs it remembers. The beeps, the hums, the far sirens, the buzz of a light that will sometimes forgive your plan and sometimes not. At home now, the lighthouse magnet holds nothing, because there are days when there is nothing to hold. The towel is a little crooked, and I leave it so. The mug ring stays on the counter all afternoon until the light goes, and then I wipe it in the dark with my hand, because I have learned you can find the circle by touch. The trekking pole leans in the closet, the way a person you used to know leans in a cafe window when you pass and decides to let you go with that. The rug by the door depresses for the cat and lifts for me and for the two shallow ovals that appear and then fade. And if anyone asks, I can call them where. Sometimes I stand at the bedroom doorway at 2 in the morning and let my eyes adjust to nothing, and I feel the air behind me cool by a degree, and I do not turn. Sometimes I go to the front room and roll the tent out on the floor and let the fabric remember that I exist, and then I roll it up again, because I cannot make it my daily life to ask it for this. Sometimes I put my ear to the refrigerator and listen to the compressor click and tell it quietly it can stop if it wishes, and the machine hums anyway. If you stand in my hall, if someday you do, I think you will see nothing until you have stood a while. Then you may see a presence lean in the glass of the picture frame I bought at the resale next to the bus stop and never put a picture in. You may hear a static, like a man at a desk radio trying to find the station that tells him he can go home. You will think of orange without meaning to. You will feel the air behind your neck tell you what to do. Stand, breathe. Let the world make of your warmth what it needs. Then fix the towel if you must, and go to the kitchen and boil the kettle without being told by any notice pinned to any board, and sit with your mug until the ring cools on the counter into the shape of a thing that will outlast this moment, and many like it. On the morning you go up there and find a tent, orange and patient, it may still be warm. You can stand in the doorway and decide not to turn, or you can step inside and lay your hand where another hand laid, and let it take you to the edge of something you can afford before walking back out into the world that calls for trucks and gates and receipts and the serial song of a scanner. Those beeps that insist on the tally where all our small goods get done. This is what I have: the woods, the town, the movements of my own body, and the way objects become concerned when you make a ritual of them. The tent remains where I left it, I think. And if it isn't, then it is somewhere like it. Sometimes I wake to the hollow quiet of the building and the stairwell light not buzzing and the refrigerator between cycles and the traffic light paused mid-wink and the town holding its breath the way we do when someone opens a zip to look in and see if we are there. I lay my hand on my chest and feel the warmth a body knows as the old sign, and I picture orange in a clearing and the shape of a man or woman stepping out of the trees and folding their hands and taking a breath and choosing the one thing that S left to choose.